Okay. Hi, this is Joel Swisher. I'm director of the Institute for Energy Studies at Western. The Institute is an academic program. We have kind of a portfolio of degree opportunities for Western students. We have two dedicated interdisciplinary majors in energy policy and management, which is a BA, and then also a BS in energy science and technology. And then we have minors in energy policy and energy science, and we have energy concentrations in both engineering and business. So there's lots of different ways to join the program, and it's a little bit different from most energy programs around the country. Most of them are actually run at the graduate level, and many are run as pretty narrow engineering programs. And while we have a big emphasis on science and technology in the program, we also think that in order to understand the context of work in the energy field, you really have to have a little broader exposure to the policy context and to the business and economics context. So all of our majors and even the minors have a mix of technical subjects and policy and business or economics, you know, with a different weighting depending on which particular degree or minor that you're after. But the idea is to prepare students to really go out and become leaders in the transition to clean energy in the Northwest and beyond. And of course, the Northwest has assumed kind of a leadership position in the clean energy transition over the last 30 odd years. The region has been really a leader in using energy efficiency as a resource and saving energy and what we call negawatts rather than producing megawatts and all of the cost and environmental impacts that go with them. And then today we're doing ever more on the transition towards using more renewable resources, including solar and wind, and electrifying services like transportation and building heating, while still relying on the legacy resources of the Northwest, which are sort of unique in having a very high concentration of renewable hydroelectric power. Now, renewable doesn't necessarily mean that it's free of environmental impacts, but it does mean that it doesn't produce carbon emissions. So that's what the program's about. We have a really cool Energy 101 course in both the fall and the winter, which is a good introduction. And many of our other somewhat more advanced courses are also pretty accessible. They may have you know, one prerequisite in math or maybe economics, but they don't have the really long chains of prerequisites that a lot of you know, engineering or other science courses and degrees have. So if one's interested, it's pretty easy to stick your toe in the water and find out what the program's about and meet some of our faculty who are really top notch as well. So that's my sales pitch for the program.
Awesome. And then to kind of dive into, I guess, more so the political side or how it applies for those that don't study energy policy, why is it still important for us as a community to pay attention to it? And I don't know how much expertise you have with regards to other regional utility policies, but if you had anything you wanted to share about that as well, that would be awesome.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been in energy and specifically in clean energy my whole career, which is a really long time. And I started back when I was in university, because to me, I had the insight that energy kind of touches everything, and it's kind of the nexus or the key lever has become a real conflict between our economic aspirations in terms of people wanting to be more affluent, as well as increasing the overall level of development in the country and in the world, with environmental sustainability, and particularly the challenge of climate change and needing to reduce CO2 emissions, not just eventually, but fast. And so energy is kind of the link between those two things, and therefore it's both a really challenging problem because it's the source of so much pollution and other problems, but it's also the source of so many opportunities because of the new technologies and new policies and new business models and just new thinking embodied in the clean energy transition. And again, the Northwest is in kind of a leadership position. And so from my standpoint, it's kind of, an essential challenge to work on for our generation. But it's also a very practical thing from the standpoint of a graduating student. There ought to be interesting and rewarding jobs and careers out there in that field. And utilities are kind of an interesting part of that. We actually have a couple of courses. We have a series of 3 courses in energy policy, a couple of which spend a lot of time talking about the regulation of utilities. We have a course specifically on electric utility planning. And, I often have a little trouble kind of recruiting students for these courses at first. It sounds like really kind of a dull and boring thing. But in fact, once you get into the work or you get into one of these classes, you find that it really is that kind of nexus of really important and challenging problems that we have to deal with, like climate change, but also vast opportunities to improve people's lives and to reduce costs and to reduce pollution and to apply all of these new exciting technologies like renewable electricity and electric vehicles and so forth. And so, it's kind of a little hidden secret that, yes, utilities are not only really important to keeping the lights on and to managing our resources and mitigating climate change, but it's also a really interesting set of problems and challenges. Would it be good to kind of describe what we mean by a utility?
Oh, yeah, sure. That would be great. Would you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, because
For sure.
again, it's one of these things we sort of take for granted, but don't really pay a lot of attention to on a daily basis. And that's probably the result of those utilities themselves doing a pretty good job, and we only notice them, when there's a problem, like the lights go out. But a utility is kind of a special type of organization. It can be either a government entity, like a municipal Seattle City Light, for example, is a municipal utility that is part of the Seattle government, or it can be a partly independent district, like a public utility district we talk about, a PUD, which in Washington are typically governed at the county level. But it can also be a privately owned, investor-owned company like Puget Sound Energy, who supplies electricity in this part of Washington and electricity and gas elsewhere. But even though it's a private company, it's fairly tightly overseen and regulated by a state government body. In Washington, it's called the Utilities and Transport Commission, the UTC. Many other states, they're called Public Utilities Commissions, PUCs. But all of these entities that we call utilities, they have the characteristic of like a company that sells a product, the service of providing electricity or water or sewage or landline telephone or now today maybe broadband. But it's not like, if your friend says, hey, I just got a ticket to fly to LA for $100. And you say, well, that sounds good. Maybe I'll go too. And you go down to SeaTac, you go to the airline counter and say, I'd like to get a $100 ticket to LA. And they say, well, sorry, today that'll cost you $800. or maybe they say, sorry, there's no seats at all, come back, in a couple days later. They don't have to take you. And even if they do take you, they don't have to necessarily give you a fair price. Utilities are different. Utilities have to serve everybody. They have to serve everybody all the time with pretty amazing reliability, like 99.9% reliability in most cases. And they have to charge you prices that are fair and equitable and basically the same for everybody all the time. And they're not supposed to discriminate or favor anybody. And so it's because they're providing these essential public services that we really can't get along without, rather than just a product that you may or may not need, that they have this kind of dual nature of being a business, but also being very tightly overseen by a public entity, whether it's a government body that owns them or an arm's length regulator like these state commissions. And so that's kind of what a utility is. And then they operate in many different ways. Like I said, some are publicly owned, part of a city government. Some are sort of semi-independent districts like the county PUDs. Others are investor-owned companies that are regulated at the state level and at a little more arm's length setup. But in all cases, they have the ability, that is to say, those government entities or regulators have the ability to lever the utility operations in a way that advances state or local public policy. For example, they might encourage them to buy more renewable energy and less fossil energy to reduce emissions, or maybe help their customers with energy efficiency, or maybe they might subsidize low-income customers, or in some way try to provide a more equitable treatment of different customer groups in their territory. They might try to ameliorate the environmental impact, which is inevitably resulting from production of energy, especially. So they have this very strong kind of policy context in their operations and in their planning.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that super in-depth, or I guess not in-depth for a quick session like this, but I feel like I've already learned so much just from like speaking with you, way more than I already knew about kind of the policy aspects of.
Well, and it sounds kind of complicated, and I guess it is complicated, but the basic structure or meaning of it, or intention of what these organizations are doing is fairly straightforward. But they're different from just a regular public company in that way, and that's why we have policy specifically directed at utilities. So
kind of to bring it to a more localized area, what communities in Washington State or Whatcom County are particularly impacted by these utility policies, whether they be public or private?
Well, I think if you think of utilities in terms of the energy utilities, for example, the electric utilities, it seems like the biggest impact has to be the impact on the environment from the production of that electric energy. And that could be burning fossil fuels, which of course produces air pollution, greenhouse gases. But even the cleaner renewable energy sources have some impact. I mean, even solar and wind power farms, take up a certain amount of land, and some people consider that a visual impact. But hydropower, which is kind of the legacy backbone of the industrial Northwest that arose starting about 100 years ago and really growing during the period of the large federal hydroelectric power projects, mostly on the Columbia River, but also in places like the Upper Skagit River, just in the eastern boundary of Whatcom County. And today we think of hydropower as clean and renewable and no CO2, but the development of all those dams and the flooding of the area behind those dams to store water, which is essentially storing energy, of course, massively changed the ecosystem and restricted the flow of fish species, in particular the various salmon species, and drastically hindered the fishing grounds for the indigenous communities. And frankly, at the time, they did it pretty much without much consultation. There's a binational treaty called the Columbia River Treaty that was signed between the governments of the United States and Canada back in 1964, I think. And it has all of these provisions for different stakeholders and people who are affected by floods and people who are buying the electricity and who pays who and who builds what. And it almost doesn't mention the indigenous landowners and their fishing grounds and other ecosystem services. And that's only being kind of revisited in the subsequent decades, kind of too little and too late probably for those populations. But energy affects the environment no matter what. And the motivation for us to consider something like energy efficiency as a resource is motivated by the idea that, well, if we can do more of the things we want to do, like heat our houses and light our workspaces with less energy, that means less environmental impact, even if it's those cleaner resources, because they have an impact too. And of course, if you study these individual cases in some detail, what you're inevitably going to find is that the greater impacts fall to populations of lower income or populations like the indigenous communities who were not seriously consulted during the development of a lot of the legacy projects. And even today, if you ask them, I'm sure they'd say they're not necessarily full partners, although they've had a much greater influence in energy policy. For example, our neighbors in the Lummi Nation were very influential in stopping the development of a coal export terminal that was proposed for kind of the northwest corner of Whatcom County. And so they've started to exert some influence in the energy policy arena, but it's been a pretty tough fight.
Awesome, thank you. And so I guess my last question before we wrap up is kind of my action item for the students that watch this. Since Western students do kind of tend to have a big focus on sustainability and equity within environmental issues, how can they get involved with local and state government to advocate for these values?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of action at the state level in energy policy and utilities and utility policy. As I mentioned a minute ago, the oversight and regulation of utilities is typically done through state government bodies, and utilities are very central to every part of the energy system, the provision of electricity, the drive to reduce the carbon emissions from electricity, to use more renewables, to switch to electric vehicles, to use energy more efficiently. All of that involves the utilities and therefore involves utility regulation and state policy. There's also a set of state policy measures that have to do with energy use in buildings. And that's another of the topics in our energy program at Western, and another one of these things where I feel initially it's kind of a hard sell, like what's interesting about energy in buildings, blah. But in fact, of course, there's a lot of really interesting technology and exciting opportunities to use efficiency as a resource to make our buildings do all the things that we want them to do and to be very, very comfortable and pleasant to live in, and to use a minimum amount of energy, or even use no more energy than they produce themselves. A net zero building is a goal. And in fact, that's a design project that we use in some of our classes for the students to find ways to design net zero buildings. At the state level, there are, particularly in Washington, a series of energy efficiency performance standards. Typically, performance standards are imposed for the construction of new buildings, and each new building has to achieve at least a minimum level of energy efficiency and not be a total energy hog, so to say. And those standards have gotten tightened over time. And we also have typically standards for the energy performance of equipment like appliances and lighting and heating and cooling equipment in order to make sure that they're not wasting energy unnecessarily. And recently, the state of Washington has kind of gone out on a limb and actually passed a new set of standards that will affect existing buildings, larger existing buildings, but the kind of buildings that we have, for example, on Western's campus will be held to a certain energy performance standard. And if they don't meet it, they'll have to make upgrades. And so the discussion and enactment and execution or enforcement of those policy measures at the state level, is something that's ongoing every day. And it's something that you can get involved in either through the legislative side of the government, or through the government agencies at the state level, like the Department of Commerce, or Department of Ecology, who are typically the departments that work on that. So there's a lot of action at the state level. Also the Utility Commission, the Utility and Transport Commission, as it's called in Washington. So there's a lot happening there in Olympia. And then at the local level, there's there's a few policy levers in things like transportation planning and planning for new construction. But also in the city of Bellingham, we have a climate action plan that the city council passed via a resolution a couple years ago that has a very aggressive timetable for reducing the community's carbon emissions pretty much to zero over the next couple of decades. And it's an ambitious target, and it's one that's challenging because as a city government, we're fairly limited into how much we can control. Those things that happen at the state level, for example, aren't necessarily levers that the city can pull, but they can try to influence them, and they can try to capture things like incentives and subsidy programs, and try to be kind of an early actor or a pioneer, so to say, in some of the clean energy technologies locally. So you might want to direct people to look at Bellingham's climate action plan. They have a climate action task force. Some of our faculty are participants in that task force, providing expert input to the city leaders. Yeah, but seriously, anyone who listens to this, if they're interested in what we're doing, and if I've convinced you that things like utilities and buildings are actually interesting, because they are, you can come and talk to us. And I do the academic advising, and my colleague Gail Cowan, she does the program advising, and either one of us would be happy to talk to students and explain more about the program and what's in it.